The rain-slicked pavement gleamed under the sodium lamps of the small-town clinic, a forgotten outpost on the edge of the desert highway, where the night air carried the faint tang of sagebrush and exhaust. It was just past midnight when Margaret, an elderly woman with silver hair pinned in a loose bun and a faded shawl draped over her shoulders, staggered toward the glass doors. Her steps faltered, her hand clutching a worn purse as if it held her last anchor to the world. The wind whipped through the empty parking lot, scattering leaves like whispers of regret. Then, without warning, her knees buckled. She collapsed in a heap, her body hitting the concrete with a dull thud that echoed into the quiet night. No one was there to see it, no cars passing, no lights flickering on in the nearby apartments. Just the rain pattering softly on her still form, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Inside the clinic, the fluorescent hum of the waiting room lights buzzed on, oblivious. Nurse Elena Ramirez, a woman in her mid-30s with calloused hands from years of bedside vigils and eyes shadowed by unspoken losses, was finishing her shift. She'd come to this dusty clinic 5 years ago, fleeing the ghosts of a city life that had chewed her up. A broken marriage, a brother lost to the streets, promises she'd made as a young girl to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Elena wiped down the counter, the scent of antiseptic clinging to her scrubs like a second skin, when the security feed on the monitor caught her eye. There, on the cold ground outside, lay Margaret, unmoving. Elena's heart seized. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing the emergency kit and her coat, she burst through the doors, the chill air slapping her face as she knelt beside the stranger. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Elena's voice cut through the rain, steady but urgent, her fingers pressing against Margaret's neck for a pulse. It was faint, thready, the kind that whispered of exhaustion, neglect, maybe something deeper. Margaret's face was etched with lines of hardship, her lips pale, a faint bruise blooming on her temple like a shadow of some hidden struggle. Eleanor worked quickly, tilting her head back, checking for breath. Her mind racing through protocols, honed from too many nights like this. She radioed for backup, but the clinic was understaffed, the town too small for miracles on demand. As she cradled Margaret's head, easing her into recovery position, a distant rumble pierced the night, not thunder but engines, low, throaty growls that vibrated through the ground like the pulse of an awakening beast. Across town, in the dim glow of a roadside diner where neon signs flickered against grease-streaked windows, a group of bikers huddled over coffee and maps. They called themselves the Iron Vows, a brotherhood forged in the fires of old wars and older regrets. Veterans who'd traded uniforms for leather vests, patches sewn with symbols of oaths unbreakable. Their leader, Jax Harlan, a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard and scars that mapped battles long buried, nursed a black coffee, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of a faded photograph. It was of his mother, gone too soon, and a promise he'd whispered to her on her deathbed, to stand for the forgotten, the ones the world left in the dust. The diner phone rang, shrill and insistent, pulling him from his reverie. It was Elena, his sister, the one family tie that had survived the storms. Her voice crackled over the line, tight with fear. "Jax, it's bad. An old woman just collapsed outside the clinic. I think she's alone, no family, no insurance. I can't let them turn her away." Jax's jaw tightened, the weight of that call settling like dust on his soul. He remembered Elena's stories of the clinic's endless fight against red tape, how the system chewed up the vulnerable and spat out bills no one could pay. Margaret's fall wasn't just a medical emergency, it was an echo of every broken vow he'd witnessed. He stood, the chair scraping back, and nodded to his crew, 88 strong, scattered across the county, but bound by blood and word. "Mount up," he said, his voice gravel rough. "We're riding for her." The diner erupted in motion, keys jingling, boots stomping as engines roared to life outside. Harleys and choppers lined the lot, chrome gleaming wet under the rain, headlights cutting through the darkness like beacons of resolve. Back at the clinic, Elena had Margaret stabilized on a gurney just inside the doors, an IV dripping life into her veins. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, murmuring something about a locket around her neck, a simple silver chain holding a photo of a young boy, faded with time. "My grandson," Margaret whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "He promised. We'd make it." Eleanor squeezed her hand, her own heart aching with the familiarity of it. Promises? They were the invisible chains that bound her to this life, to Jack's, to the family they'd chosen when blood had failed them. She'd lost her way once after the divorce, drifting until Jack's pulled her back with a simple oath. "We're all we've got. We ride for each other." The ground trembled first, a low vibration that built into a thunderous wave. Elena looked up as the convoy crested the hill, a river of steel and leather pouring into the parking lot. 88 bikes, fenders mud-splattered, riders in weathered jackets emblazoned with the Iron Vows emblem, a clenched fist around a broken chain. Jax dismounted first, his boots splashing in puddles, and strode toward the doors. The other nurses froze, eyes wide at the spectacle, but Elena met his gaze with a nod. No words needed. This was their way. "What's her name?" Jax asked, peering at Margaret's pale face. "Margaret Ellis," Elena replied, checking the chart. "No insurance, no next of kin listed. The system's already flagging her for discharge, once she's stable. Too costly, they say." Jax's eyes darkened, the rain tracing rivulets down his face. He thought of his mother's last days, turned away from care because of paperwork and pride. Not on our watch. He turned to his second, a wiry veteran named Cole, who pulled out a satchel heavy with cash, savings from runs, donations from the road, every cent earned in service to the forgotten. "Tell the doc we're covering it, all of it, and whatever she needs after." As the bikers formed a loose perimeter, their presence a shield against the indifferent night, Margaret stirred again. Her eyes met Jax's, confusion giving way to a spark of gratitude. "Who are you?" she murmured. "Folks who keep promises," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of miles and memories. Eleanor watched, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. This was redemption in motion, not with fists or fury, but with the quiet power of standing firm. The rain eased, the first hints of dawn brushing the horizon in pale gold as the Iron Vows settled in to wait. What started as one woman's fall would ripple outward, binding strangers in a web of loyalty, challenging the cold machinery of a world that forgot its own. But for now, in the hush before the storm, it was enough to know they'd answered the call. The first rays of dawn crept over the clinic's rooftop like hesitant fingers, painting the parking lot in hues of amber and shadow. The rumble of engines had faded to a low idle, the Iron Vows convoy, a steadfast wall of chrome and resolve against the waking world. Jax Harlan stood just inside the clinic doors, his leather vest creaking as he shifted his weight, watching Elena adjust the IV line on Margaret's arm. The elderly woman's color was returning, faint pink flushing her cheeks, but her eyes held a distant storm, memories surfacing like debris in a receding flood. The air inside smelled of sterile linens and fresh coffee brewing in the break room, a small comfort amid the tension. Elena glanced up at her brother, her dark hair tied back in a practical ponytail, strands escaping like threads of worry. "Vitals are stabilizing," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd pulled life from the brink too many times. Dehydration, exhaustion, maybe a mild infection from neglect, but the real fight's with the paperwork. The administrator's already on the line, quoting policies about unpaid accounts. She nodded toward the hallway, where fluorescent lights buzzed over a cluster of offices. The clinic, a squat building of faded brick, served the fringes of the highway towns. Folk scraping by on odd jobs and faded dreams, where every treatment came with a ledger of debts. Jax's gaze hardened, the scar along his jaw tightening like a drawn bowstring. He remembered the vow he'd made to his mother, whispered in a dim hospital room years ago, to shield the vulnerable from the grind of indifference. It had pulled him from the haze of post-war drift, forging the iron vows from scattered souls like himself, veterans, wanderers, all bound by oaths etched deeper than ink. "Cole," he called over his shoulder, his voice a low rumble that cut through the murmur of the arriving staff. The wiry biker, with his tattooed arms and steady eyes, stepped forward, the satchel still slung across his chest. Inside, it held not just cash, but symbols of their collective honor, funds pooled from charity rides, mechanic gigs, and the quiet sales of custom parts that kept their machines humming. As the morning light strengthened, filtering through rain-streaked windows, Margaret stirred on the gurney. Her fingers, gnarled like desert roots, clutched the locket at her throat. "The boy, Tommy," she murmured, her voice cracking like dry earth. Elena leaned in, her hand gentle on Margaret's shoulder. "Your grandson. And tell me about him." The words unlocked a floodgate. Margaret's eyes, cloudy with age, sharpened with recollection. Tommy had been her anchor after her husband passed, a bright-eyed kid with dreams of the open road. But life had twisted. Tommy's father, a drifter with a temper, had taken the boy years ago, leaving echoes of absence. "He promised he'd come back," Margaret whispered. "Said we'd ride together one day, see the horizons his grandpa talked about." The locket's photo showed a younger Tommy, grinning beside a vintage bike, the kind with curves like a promise unkept. Outside, the bikers dismounted fully now, forming a loose circle in the lot. Their jackets bore the emblem proudly, a fist gripping a chain link, symbolizing bonds that no force could snap. Among them was Lena, a sharp-eyed mechanic with grease under her nails and a backstory of her own, a former army medic who'd lost her squad to bureaucracy's blind eye. She leaned against her chopper, sharing a thermos of hot coffee with the group, her voice carrying on the breeze. "Heard the call on the radio. Elena's kin don't ask lightly." Nods rippled through the crew, a silent affirmation. They'd ridden through storms worse than this rain, from flood rescues to standing guard at evictions, always for the unspoken code. Honor the fallen promises of the world. Inside, the administrator, a pinched-faced man named Harlan, no relation, but the coincidence irked Jax, emerged from his office, clipboard in hand. His tie was askew, eyes darting nervously at the sea of leather visible through the glass. "Nurse Ramirez, this is irregular. We can't just—" He faltered as Jax stepped forward, Cole at his side. The air thickened with unspoken challenge, the scent of wet leather mingling with the clinic's clean sharpness. "We're covering Mrs. Ellis's care," Jack stated, his tone even, like gravel under tires. "Every test, every day, every follow-up, no questions." He nodded to Cole, who unzipped the satchel, revealing stacks of bills, clean earned through sweat and solidarity. Harlan's eyes widened, a flicker of greed warring with caution. "This isn't how it works. Insurance, approvals." Eleanor's voice cut in, firm and unyielding. "It works if we make it. She's stable because I acted. And now her family's stepping up." She met Harlan's gaze, her own reflecting the scars of battles fought in quieter ways, the nights consoling patients turned away, the promises to her brother to never let the system win. Harlan hesitated, the weight of 88 shadows outside pressing like an invisible tide. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine, but if this causes issues—" His words trailed off as he retreated, the door clicking shut behind him. Margaret, overhearing fragments, reached for Jax's arm. Her touch was frail but insistent. Why? Strangers don't. Jax knelt beside her, the dawn light catching the silver in his beard. Because promises bind us. My mother taught me that. Yours deserves keeping too. He glanced at the locket. A bang twisting in his chest. Tommy's face so like the lost boys he'd seen on the roads, adrift without anchors. Elena watched the exchange, her heart swelling with the familiar ache of their shared path. She'd fled the city after vowing to rebuild, Jax pulling her into the fold with his unyielding faith. This moment, raw and real, echoed their own redemption. From fractured lives to a chosen kin that rode as one. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the lot, the bikers began to organize. Some headed to the diner for shifts of watch, others coordinating with local shops for supplies, blankets, meals, anything to ease Margaret's vigil. Whispers spread among them of deeper currents, rumors of Tommy tangled in troubles far off, echoes of old debts that might surface. Jax stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air laced with sage and engine oil. The convoy gleamed, a testament to endurance. But as a distant siren wailed, perhaps an ambulance, perhaps something more, Jax felt the stir of unease. Saving one life was a spark, uncovering the chains around it could ignite a fire. For now, though, they held the line. Loyalty's quiet roar, drowning out the world's indifferent hum. The clinic hummed with newfound purpose, nurses moving with cautious optimism. Eleanor charted notes, her pen scratching like a vow renewed. Margaret slept now, her breath steady, the locket resting against her chest like a talisman. Outside, the iron vows waited, engines cooling but spirits aflame. Dawn had broken, but the real journey, the one of truths unearthed and oaths fulfilled, was just beginning. In the balance of honor and shadow, they rode on, unseen guardians against the fade. The midday sun beat down on the clinic's parking lot like a relentless interrogator, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage that distorted the Iron Vow's lineup of bikes into ghostly sentinels. Jax Harlan wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the leather of his glove sticking slightly to his skin, carrying the faint scent of oil and sun-baked earth. He'd sent half the crew to rotate shifts at the diner down the road, their absence leaving the lot quieter but no less charged. The air hummed with the low murmur of conversations, bikers leaning against fenders, sharing smokes and stories, their voices a gravelly chorus against the distant whine of highway traffic. Elena had pulled Jax aside earlier, her expression tight with concern, whispering about Margaret's murmurs in her sleep. Fragments of arguments, a name repeated like a plea, Tommy. It stirred something in Jax, an echo of his own buried regrets. The boy he'd once been before the wars and the roads claimed him. Inside, the clinic's corridors felt narrower under the weight of the morning's decisions. Elena moved with purposeful grace between rooms, her scrubs whispering against the linoleum, the scent of fresh bandages mingling with the underlying sharpness of medicine. Margaret was in a small recovery room now, propped up on pillows that Elena had scavenged from storage. Her silver hair fanned out like threads of moonlight against the crisp white. The elderly woman's eyes, clearer now with rest and fluids, followed Elena as she checked the monitors. Beeps punctuated the quiet, steady as a heartbeat rediscovered. "You remind me of my daughter-in-law," Margaret said softly, her voice gaining strength, laced with the warmth of desert winds. Gone now, but she had that same fire, fighting for what was right, even when the world pushed back. Elena paused, her fingers lingering on the pulse oximeter clip. She thought of her own losses, the brother who'd vanished into the city's underbelly, the marriage that crumbled under unspoken vows, broken. "Family's what we make it," she replied, pulling up a chair, the metal frame scraping faintly. "Tell me more about Tommy. The locket. It's more than a photo, isn't it?" Margaret's hand drifted to the chain, her thumb tracing the engraved initials on the back. T.E. for Thomas Ellis, her grandson, now a man in his 20s, or so the years suggested. The story unfolded in halting breaths, painting pictures of a boy raised on tales of open roads and unbreakable bonds. Tommy's father, a restless soul with a shadow of temper, had uprooted them after the grandfather's passing, dragging the boy into a life of fleeting towns and hollow promises. "He was 10 when they left," Margaret said, her eyes misting. "Left me this locket as a vow. He'd return. We'd fix up his grandpa's old bike and ride to the coast, see the ocean his stories dreamed of." But contact faded, letters unanswered, until rumors trickled back. Tommy entangled in some distant trouble, a web of debts and desperate choices that the system labeled as failure. Jax entered then, his boots thudding softly on the threshold, the door creaking like an old confession. He'd been outside coordinating with Cole, who was on the phone with a network of old contacts, fellow riders scattered across state lines, ears to the ground for whispers of a young man named Thomas Ellis. The satchel of funds had bought Margaret's immediate care, but Jax sensed deeper currents, the kind that pulled families under like hidden riptides. "Heard you talking," Jax said, settling on the windowsill, the sunlight catching the frayed edges of his vest. His voice was steady, but his eyes held the weight of shared scars, veterans' tales exchanged around campfires, promises made in foxholes that outlasted the battles. Margaret studied him, her gaze sharpening. "You look like you've carried a few loads yourself. Why help an old stranger like me?" "Because vows don't expire," Jax answered, his words simple, carved from years on the edge. He pulled a worn photo from his pocket, his mother, smiling faintly in a hospital bed, the same one Elena had shown him as a reminder. "Mine made this club. We ride for the ones the roads forget." Elena nodded, her presence a quiet anchor, the bond between siblings unspoken but ironclad. She'd joined the Vow's orbit after her divorce, finding purpose in their runs for the lost, delivering aid to flood-struck towns, standing vigil at orphanages overlooked by aid trucks. This felt like that, amplified, one woman's fall unearthing a legacy of absence. As afternoon shadows lengthened, casting striped patterns across the room, a knock echoed from the hallway. It was Harlan, the administrator, his face paler than before, clipboard clutched like a shield. Behind him loomed a pair of suited figures, officials from the county health board, their briefcases gleaming with bureaucratic finality. The air thickened, carrying the faint cologne of authority clashing with the clinic's sterile tang. "Mrs. Ellis's case has been flagged," the lead official said. "A woman with a severe bun and eyes like polished stone. Uninsured patients require evaluation for eligibility programs, and these funds," she glanced at the satchel Cole had left with Elena, "need documentation. We can't accept untraceable contributions without oversight." Jax rose slowly, his frame filling the doorway, the sunlight haloing him like a figure from an old Western tale. Tension coiled in the room, silent as a held breath. Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. "She's stable because we acted fast. Those funds are clean, earned through charity events, rides for causes like this. You want paperwork? We'll get it." The official's lips thinned, but her gaze flicked to the window, where the remaining bikers stood watch. Their postures relaxed yet vigilant, engines purring idly like watchful guardians. Whispers of the Iron Vow's reputation preceded them. Not outlaws, but oath-keepers who'd bent rules for the greater good, from escorting ambulances through storms to funding wells in forgotten reservations. Margaret's hand tightened on the bedsheet, her frailty masking a spark of defiance. "My grandson. If he's out there lost in your systems, I won't let you bury this too." The words hung, a moral gauntlet thrown. The officials exchanged glances, the weight of potential scrutiny, 88 riders ready to amplify a story of neglect, tipping the scales. "We'll..." Review it, the woman conceded, retreating with her colleague, the door clicking shut like a temporary truce. Outside, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the desert in fiery strokes, Cole approached Jax with news from the contacts. A lead on Tommy, spotted in a border town, tangled in a shady operation that smelled of corruption, unscrupulous lenders preying on the desperate, shielded by lax oversight. Jax's jaw set, the promise to Margaret intertwining with his own code. Elena joined them, her shift ending but her resolve unbroken. "This isn't just about her care anymore," she said, the wind tugging at her hair. "It's about pulling him back, honoring what he vowed." The bikers revved engines in solidarity, a low thunder building. Dusk settled, stars pricking the sky like distant hopes as the convoy prepared to extend their ride, not just for one life saved, but for the chains of loyalty that bound them all. Shadows lengthened, but in their wake the light of redemption flickered stronger, urging them onward into the gathering night. The velvet drape of twilight settled over the clinic like a shroud, the desert sky bruising into deep indigos, streaked with the last embers of sunset. Jax Harlan stood at the edge of the parking lot, his silhouette etched against the fading light, the faint grit of sand whispering against his boots as a warm breeze stirred the sagebrush. The Iron Vows bikes formed a ragged semicircle, their chrome accents catching the first glimmers of starlight, engines ticking softly as they cooled from the day's vigil. Inside, Elena Ramirez lingered by Margaret's bedside, the room bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp that cast long shadows across the walls, mingling with the steady beep of monitors like a metronome of fragile hope. Margaret's breathing had evened out, but her dreams seemed restless, her fingers twitching toward the locket as if grasping for the boy who'd slipped away years ago. Jax's phone buzzed in his pocket, a low vibration that cut through the quiet like a warning shot. He pulled it out, the screen illuminating his weathered face in harsh blue. It was Cole, voice tight over the crackle of a poor connection from the border town lead. "Got eyes on him, Jax. Tommy Ellis works the edges of a chop shop down here, fixing rigs for some lowlifes running parts across the line. Looks worn, like the road's taken its toll, but there's heat. These guys he's with, they're tied to a ring, squeezing folks dry, loans with teeth, the kind that leave marks without a trace." Jax's grip tightened on the phone, the plastic creaking under his calloused palm. He could picture it, dimly lit garages reeking of rust and desperation, young men like Tommy caught in webs spun by greed, promises to family drowned out by the roar of necessity. It mirrored his own drift after the service, nights staring at the ceiling, the weight of oaths to fallen brothers pressing like unseen chains. Eleanor caught the shift in his posture from the window, her reflection superimposed over the darkening lot. She stepped out, the clinic door sighing shut behind her, the cool evening air carrying the distant howl of a coyote. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice low, threaded with the exhaustion of a day spent bridging lives. Jax relayed the details, his words measured, each one landing like gravel on the path ahead. Elena's eyes, shadowed by the day's battles, flickered with a mix of resolve and ache. She'd seen too many like Tommy in the ER, kids hardened young, scars hidden under bravado, families fractured by choices not their own. Margaret needs to know he's out there, fighting his way back. But if we ride in blind... She trailed off, the unspoken risk hanging between them. Stirring a hornet's nest could drag them all under, turning a simple vow into a storm. Back in the room, Margaret had woken partially, propped against pillows that smelled faintly of fresh laundry and hospital starch. The locket lay open on the bedside table, Tommy's photo gazing out with the innocence of youth, his smile a stark contrast to the man Cole described. She turned as Elena re-entered, her gaze searching. "You look troubled, child. Is it about my Tommy?" Elena hesitated, then sat, taking Margaret's hand, cool and papery, yet holding the quiet strength of endurance. "We're looking for him, my brother's crew. They don't leave stones unturned." Margaret's eyes welled, tears tracing paths down cheeks lined by decades of waiting. He was always the dreamer like his grandpa. That old bike in the shed rusted now, but he swore we'd restore it together. "Grandma," he said, "promises are the real engines. They get you through the dark." The words struck Elena deep, echoing her own pact with Jax after their losses, to rebuild not just lives, but the bonds that weather had frayed. Outside, the bikers gathered closer, their circle tightening as word spread. Lena, the mechanic with her toolkit slung over one shoulder, fiddled with a loose chain on her bike, the metallic clink punctuating the murmurs. "If this Tommy's neck deep, we'll need more than cash. Contacts down south, old squad mates who know the backways." Nods rippled through the group, faces illuminated by the glow of cigarettes. Each man and woman a tapestry of their own redemptions. A former cop ousted for calling out corruption. A widow who turned grief into guardianship runs for runaways. Jax joined them, his presence drawing the circle inward. "We ride at first light," he said, voice carrying the rumble of conviction. "But smart, no charging in. Scout first, pull him out clean. For Margaret, for the vow he made." The crew affirmed with low grunts and fist bumps, the air thick with the scent of leather and anticipation, stars wheeling overhead like witnesses to their pact. As night deepened, the clinic's lights dimmed to night mode, casting the building in a hush of amber pools. Harlan, the administrator, slunk through the halls, his footsteps echoing with unease. He'd overheard the bikers' plans, the talk of border runs stirring his own buried fears, of audits, of the health board circling back with sharper questions. He cornered Elena in the break room, the coffee machine gurgling like a reluctant confession. "This is escalating, Ramirez. Unofficial funds now talk of excursions. If it ties back here, we're all exposed." Elena met his stare, her posture unyielding, the steam from her mug rising like resolve. "Exposed to what? Doing right. Margaret's stable because we pushed. Tommy's story. It's the same fight. You want to call it in? Go ahead. But the vows don't back down from shadows." Harlan backed away, his clipboard a flimsy barrier, the weight of potential fallout etching new lines on his face. In the recovery room, Jack sat with Margaret now, Elena stepping out for air. The elderly woman's stories flowed freer in the quiet hours, tales of Tommy's childhood pranks, racing makeshift carts through dusty fields, vowing eternal loyalty under cottonwood trees. "He carried that spark," she said, her voice a gentle tide. "Lost it somewhere, but it's there." Jax listened, his own memories surfacing, a mother's hand in his, urging him to honor the overlooked. "We'll find that spark," he promised, the words sealing like solder on steel. As midnight approached, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows like impatient summons. Elena rejoined them, sensing the shift, the journey expanding from rescue to reclamation, promises intertwining like roads converging. Dawn would bring the ride south, but for now, the night held its breath. The iron vows camped in the lot, bedrolls unrolled under the stars, their low chatter a balm against the unknown. Margaret drifted to sleep with a faint smile, the locket clasped tight. Elena and Jax shared a glance outside, siblings bound by more than blood. Oaths forged in fire, now extending to strangers who needed them most. The horizon hinted at light, but shadows lingered, promising tests of loyalty that would forge them anew. In the quiet weave of night, redemption whispered onward, a engine idling for the miles ahead. If this tale of quiet courage and unbreakable bonds is stirring something in you, please hit that like button. It helps spread these stories of honor to those who need them most. The first blush of dawn cracked the eastern sky like a fragile eggshell. spilling pale light over the clinic's parking lot, where the Iron Vows bikes stood ready, their engines coughing to life in a symphony of low growls and metallic sighs. Jax Harlan swung his leg over his Harley, the leather seat creaking under his weight, the familiar vibration thrumming through his bones like an old friend's handshake. The air was crisp, laced with the sharp bite of dew on sagebrush and the faint acrid tang of cooling exhaust from the night's watch. 88 riders, pared down to a core group of 20 for the scouting run, formed up behind him. Cole on his flank, Lena revving her customized chopper with a nod of grim determination. Elena stood at the clinic doors, her scrubs swapped for a worn jacket, arms crossed against the chill, her eyes locking with Jax's in a silent exchange of resolve. "Bring him back," she said, her voice steady but threaded with the ache of what-ifs. Margaret, peering from her window, clutched the locket, her frail form a beacon of the promise driving them south. The convoy rolled out like a steel serpent uncoiling, tires humming over cracked asphalt as they merged onto the highway that snaked toward the border. Dust devils swirled in their wake, kicked up by the wind that whipped through Jax's beard, carrying whispers of distant canyons and hidden arroyos. Miles blurred into a hypnotic rhythm, guardrails flashing by, the sun climbing to gild the horizon in gold, the desert unfolding like an ancient scroll of secrets. Jax's mind wandered to the roads of his youth, post-service drifts where he'd chased ghosts of brothers lost, vowing never to let another soul fade into the margins. Tommy Ellis, from the scraps Cole had gathered, was no different, a young man hardened by absence, patching together a life in the shadows of a chop shop that fronted for sharper dealings, unscrupulous traders peddling parts and pressing debts on the desperate, their grip subtle but unyielding, leaving echoes of strain without overt marks. By mid-morning, the landscape shifted, the open highway giving way to narrower roads, flanked by scrubby mesquite and chain-link fences, scarred by rust. The border town emerged like a mirage, low-slung buildings huddled against the heat, air heavy with the scent of sun-baked adobe and simmering chilies from roadside taquerias. Jax signaled the pull-off at a dusty overlook, the bikes idling down to a murmur as the crew dismounted, stretching limbs stiff from the ride. Cole unfolded a crumpled map on his tank, marked with scribbles from their contacts. The shop, tucked in an industrial sprawl on the outskirts, a warren of garages where engines screamed louder than consciences. "He's there, fixing rigs," Cole said, his voice low, eyes scanning the horizon where heat haze blurred the town. "But the boss calls himself Reyes, runs tight. Word is, Tommy's in deep, covering old loans from his old man. One wrong move, and they close ranks." Lena adjusted her toolkit, the clank of wrenches a punctuation to her words. "We go in as customers first. I know bikes, can spot Tommy from the work bay. No drama unless they force it." Jax nodded, the plan settling like dust on his resolve. This wasn't about confrontation. It was reclamation, honoring the vow etched in Margaret's locket, a boy's promise to return, now tangled in the world's indifferent snares. They split into pairs, rolling into town under the guise of weary travelers seeking parts, the sun beating down like an unrelenting judge as they navigated potholed streets lined with faded murals of saints and serpents. The chop shop squatted at the end of a gravel lane, its corrugated walls rattling under the pulse of air compressors and the grind of grinders. Oil stains bloomed across the concrete like spilled secrets, the air thick with the metallic bite of sparks and the low hum of fluorescent tubes overhead. Jax and Cole eased their bikes to the entrance, engines cutting off with a final sigh, drawing glances from grease-smeared workers in coveralls. Inside the main bay, figures moved like shadows, hunched over disassembled frames, tools flashing in the dim light. Jax's gaze swept the space, landing on a young man in his mid-20s, lean and tattooed, wiping sweat from his brow as he torqued a bolt on a stripped-down frame. Tommy Ellis, unmistakable from the photo. Though years had etched lines of weariness around his eyes, his movements precise but haunted, like a man balancing on a fraying edge. Reyes emerged from an office alcove, a stocky figure with a gold chain glinting against his shirt, his smile sharp as a switchblade. "What can I do for you, riders? Parts? Custom work?" His eyes flicked over their vests, assessing the Iron Vows emblem, drawing a subtle tension. Jax kept his tone even, gravel rough from the road. "Looking for a chain drive kit, heard you fix 'em solid." As Lena bartered details with a mechanic, Jax edged closer to Tommy, who paused, wrench in hand, his gaze lifting with a flicker of wariness. Up close, the young man's face bore faint signs of strain, shadows under his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. "You Thomas Ellis?" Jax asked quietly, under the din of the shop. Tommy froze, the wrench slipping slightly in his grip, his eyes narrowing like a cornered animal's. "Who wants to know?" The words came out edged, defensive, but beneath them Jax caught the echo of the boy in the locket, curious, yearning. Before Jax could press, Reyes circled back, his presence a chill draft. "Old friends?" he probed, his voice oily, hand resting casually near a workbench cluttered with tools that could double as weapons. The air thickened, the grind of nearby machinery masking the undercurrent of suspicion. Cole shifted subtly, positioning to block the exit, while Lena's hand hovered near her satchel, ready with the cover story of a family emergency. Tommy's jaw tightened, conflict etching his features, the pull of the life he'd built in desperation, warring with the ghost of a grandmother's faith. "Ain't got friends asking questions," he muttered. But his eyes darted, searching Jax's face for intent. Jax leaned in, voice dropping to a rumble that cut through the noise. "Your grandma's waiting. Collapsed last night, but she's fighting back. War this." He tapped his chest where a locket might hang, the gesture simple, laden with the weight of unspoken oaths. Tommy's breath hitched, color draining from his face, the wrench clattering to the floor. In that suspended moment, the shop's clamor faded, leaving only the raw pulse of recognition, the promise resurfacing like a buried spring. Reyes stepped forward, sensing the shift, his demeanor hardening. "Time to wrap talk. We got work here." But Tommy backed away, eyes wide with a dawning storm, the chains of his current bind cracking under the call of blood and word. Jack signaled the crew with a subtle nod, extraction now, clean and swift. As shouts rose and shadows moved in the bays, the Iron Vows moved as one. Loyalty's quiet force uncoiling, engines roared to life outside, a thunderous invitation, while inside, Jax extended a hand to Tommy. "Ride with us. Honor what you swore." The young man hesitated, the desert wind rattling the shop's loose panels like fate knocking, his choice hanging in the balance of redemption's fragile dawn. The standoff stretched, tension coiling like a spring in the heat-shimmering air, as Tommy's gaze flickered between the life that had trapped him and the horizon calling him home. Reyes barked orders, workers pausing with wary eyes, but the vows held their ground. Not with aggression, but the unyielding wall of purpose. In the end, Tommy reached out, grasping Jax's hand, the grip firm with the spark of reclaimed honor. They burst from the shop, mounting up amid the chaos of revving bikes and scattering dust, the convoy peeling away toward the open road. Miles unfurled behind them, the border town's grit fading, but the true test lingered. The shadows of debts pursued, promises tested in the fire ahead. Back north, Eleanor waited, Margaret's hope a quiet flame, as the ride forged onward, binding fractured souls in the unbreakable chain of chosen family. The roar of engines faded into the vast hush of the desert highway as the Iron Vows convoy thundered northward, the sun arcing high overhead like a watchful eye. Jax Harlan led the pack, his Harley cutting through the wind that tugged at his vest, carrying the dry scent of creosote bushes and sun-warmed sand. Tommy Ellis rode shotgun on Cole's bike, his posture rigid at first, hands clenched white-knuckled on the grips, but gradually easing as Miles peeled away the border town's grime. The young man's face, dusted with road grit, bore the fresh etch of turmoil, eyes shadowed by the chop shop's ghosts, but flickering now with a tentative light, like embers stirred from ash. Behind them, Lena and the others formed a protective wedge, their bikes humming in unison, chrome flashing against the endless blue sky. No pursuit had materialized yet, but Jax felt the undercurrent, the subtle drag of unfinished debts trailing like exhaust fumes. Hours blurred into a relentless rhythm, the landscape shifting from barren flats to the familiar rise of sage-dotted hills leading back to the clinic town. Tommy had spoken little during the ride, his voice lost to the wind, but fragments emerged at fuel stops, halting confessions of how his father's wanderlust had dragged him south, loans piling like unpaid tolls until the chop shop became a cage disguised as shelter. "Reyes had me fixing stolen parts, covering for their squeezes on folks like me," he'd muttered, staring at the horizon. "Promised Grandma I'd make it right, but the road, it twists you." Jax nodded, his own scars itching under the leather, a reminder of vows forged in foxholes where survival meant honoring the fallen no matter the cost. This ride wasn't escape, it was reclamation, pulling a lost soul back to the promise that anchored him. As dusk painted the sky in strokes of crimson and violet, the clinic's lights winked into view, a beacon amid the cooling shadows. Elena stood in the parking lot, her jacket zipped against the evening chill, arms wrapped around herself as if holding back the day's worries. Margaret had been moved to a sunlit room, her recovery steady, under the watchful care now funded without question, Harlan's protests silenced by the weight of the vow's presence, and the quiet threat of their story spreading. The convoy rolled in like a receding wave, engines idling down to soft purrs, dust settling in golden motes. Tommy dismounted first, his boots crunching on gravel, hesitation rooting him until Jax's hand clapped his shoulder, a silent urging, heavy with understanding. Inside, the corridor smelled of polished floors and faint lavender from a vase Eleanor had placed by Margaret's door. The elderly woman's eyes, brighter now with days of rest, widened as Tommy entered, the locket clutched in her lap like a compass, finally pointing true. He froze in the threshold, the room's soft light catching the lines of hardship on his face, the boy from the photo overlaid with the man he'd become. "Grandma," he whispered, voice cracking like parched earth yielding to rain. Margaret extended her arms, frail but insistent, and he crossed the space in 2 strides, sinking to his knees beside the bed. Their embrace was wordless at first, tears tracing silent paths, hers of relief, his of release, the air thick with the unspoken years, the vow that had survived the distance. Elena lingered in the doorway, her throat tight, watching the reunion unfold like a scene from one of her late-night reveries, fractured pieces mending under the quiet force of loyalty. Jax joined her, his broad frame filling the space, a nod passing between siblings that spoke volumes, their own bond, tested by losses and rebuilt on roads like this, now extended to these strangers turned kin. "You did it," she murmured, her hand brushing his arm. Jax shook his head slightly. "We all did. The vows. We're the promise keepers." Outside, the crew dismounted fully, forming a loose vigil in the lot, sharing thermoses of coffee under the emerging stars, their low chatter a balm against the night's deepening chill. But resolution carried shadows. Word had trickled in via Cole's contacts. Reyes's operation, rattled by the extraction, was stirring ripples. Calls to local enforcers, attempts to reclaim their asset through veiled threats to the clinic's funding. Harlan, pale and fidgety in the admin office, had relayed a tense voicemail from the health board, probing deeper into the unorthodox payments. Jax gathered the core group in the diner's back booth that night, the neon buzz overhead casting flickering glows on weathered faces. Maps and scribbled notes spread across the table, the scent of burgers and strong brew grounding the strategy. "They'll come sniffing," Jack said, his voice a low anchor. "But we don't run. We expose it. The loans, the preying on the desperate. Tommy's got the details. We get 'em to the right ears." Tommy, seated among them for the first time, nodded, his resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. "I kept records, hidden ledgers of their marks. Folks like my dad, squeezed till they broke." Lena leaned in, her mechanic's eyes sharp. "We ride with proof. Contacts up north, reporters who've run our stories before, the ones on corruption in the fringes." The plan coalesced. A dawn escort for Tommy to a safe house, documents forwarded to allies who'd amplify the truth without the blaze of confrontation. It was justice poetic, not vengeful, unraveling the web through light, honoring the moral code that bound the vows. By morning, the air hummed with purpose, the sun cresting to illuminate the clinic in warm hues. Margaret, discharged with a wheelchair and Elena's arm for support, watched from the lot as Tommy mounted a borrowed bike, the crew forming up around him. Her hand waved, the locket glinting, a symbol now of cycles closed and new roads opened. "Go make it right!" she called, her voice carrying clear, laced with pride. Tommy revved the engine, a grin breaking through, the spark she'd described fully alight. The convoy pulled out, a river of resolve flowing toward reckoning, leaving the clinic quieter but fortified. Weeks later, the ripples crested. Headlines in regional papers spoke of a dismantled ring, debts forgiven through quiet settlements, officials scrambling under scrutiny. The clinic thrived, Harlan's ledgers balanced by anonymous donors inspired by the tale. Jax and Eleanor stood on the clinic steps one evening, the desert wind whispering promises kept. "Family's what endures," Jack said, echoing his mother's words. Elena smiled, the weight of their shared path lighter now. Margaret and Tommy settled nearby, the old bike in the shed slowly reviving under willing hands, a grandfather's legacy restored. In the weave of loyalty and redemption, the iron vows rode on, guardians of the forgotten oaths, their thunder a quiet testament to honor's enduring roar.